And for more on that, let's cross to business editor Stephen Carroll, who joins us from the World Economic Forum in Davos. Stephen, Donald Trump in his big speech saying America first doesn't mean America alone.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Donald Trump's speech was probably remarkable for being reasonably unremarkable. There wasn't any great, I suppose, new policy announcements from the president, and it was a speech that was quite muted in tone. He stuck very closely to his script throughout with this message to promote America, saying it is the best time to come and invest in America to all those business leaders who were in the room. And the 1,600-seater room was completely full, I can tell you. So that was his main message. He did make some comments, as you just mentioned, about trade, where he pointed really was a nod at China, saying that they wouldn't tolerate things like intellectual property theft anymore, but saying that America was still open to concluding trade deals that were good for the United States. The business people in the audience had mixed reactions to what the president had to say. Let's take a listen to some of the ones that I spoke to earlier.
Believe in free trade, but they also want fair trade and reciprocal trade. And here's where the dicey part comes in. I think the Trump people feel very strongly that there's a number of countries, and I think they're thinking of China here, that don't play by the rules. And so there's that sort of source of friction. The other parts of the message were fairly bland, and I think aimed at this audience to try to reassure this audience.
He will clearly make deals to ensure that people invest, and I'm not sure that he has made a lot of friends. I mean, because with one speech you cannot clean everything that has been said, but he probably has achieved something which is about showing to the people that he can be reasonable in a speech and that he's rational, in fact. I think that was clearly the objective. You could see that he was in a mood where he was not overexcited, if I could say.
You know, he can do it for 10 minutes. He can try to sound like a regular Republican, but he doesn't fool anybody. And you saw how quickly he started attacking fake news. He's a demagogue. These are the tactics that demagogues use, right? He's slippery, but we can't be fooled by him. Absolutely not.
The issue of regulation, which seems very abstract, is actually very important and weighs on businesses. One businessman told me that one set of reports that they have to do for the U.S. government is 40,000 pages. So that's a message that people are hearing, and that it's a freer economy than many others. And I think it's made Europe more nervous because it is going to draw investment into the United States.
Well, that was just some of the reactions that we had, speaking to myself and my colleague Armel Coe a little bit earlier, just outside the Congress Hall after Donald Trump finished his speech. So fairly muted responses to what was a fairly muted speech from Donald Trump. There was a moment of booing during the questions after the speech, Donald Trump said that when he was a businessman, the press treated him quite well, but as soon as he decided to run for office, he said they were mean and nasty and fake, and that provoked a boo and a few hisses from the journalists section of the Congress Hall as well.
Yeah, one of the people you interviewed there talking about regulation. At one point in the speech, he says regulation is stealth taxation. And there was the sense at that moment that what we heard from Donald Trump was very different from what we heard from France's President Emmanuel Macron on Wednesday.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they did have one similar message. Emmanuel Macron said at one point during his speech that France is back, and Donald Trump said that America is roaring back. Back from where? It's not entirely clear, but it was a similar message being actually used by quite many business leaders. And on the regulation issue, Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump do share some views on that. Emmanuel Macron is also trying to reduce red tape for French businesses. So from that point of view, at least the two leaders do seem to agree on what's needed to invest in their countries. Look, it was a sales pitch from Donald Trump. As we heard there, you know, he's a good salesman and he used his sales skills to try and be a cheerleader for the United States. He wasn't the only one during this week of the World Economic Forum. Narendra Modi from India did it, Theresa May did it, Emmanuel Macron did it. You know, it's become somewhat of a tradition, at least at this meeting of the World Economic Forum, that world leaders want to get up because the global economy is doing very well. They want to attract some of the money that's out there. And when you're sitting in a room with a captive audience of some of the world's biggest business leaders, CEOs of some of the world's biggest companies, it's a good time for you to pitch why your country should attract investment over others. Of course, Donald Trump's speech was slightly different in terms of the idea of continuing with international cooperation and globalization. We had Emmanuel Macron defending, of course, the idea of a renewed globalization that was fairer, that dealt with the issue of inequality better than it has done in the past. So plenty of differences there too, but it has been a bit of a week of sales pitches from those world leaders. One issue I'd say in the past week that came up that perhaps was more prominent this year than it has been before, and that's been female participation in Davos and the issue of gender equality. So the 7 co-chairs of this year's World Economic Forum meeting were all women for the first time. I interviewed one of them on Monday of this week, Chetna Sinha, and she was saying that for her it was the most important thing about Davos, the symbolism of having 7 co-chairs for this meeting. And that, this is an organisation and an event that has difficulty attracting women. Only 21% of the official participants are female. It's a figure that's up very slightly from last year, and it is something that, the Forum are making an effort to try to attract more women to this event. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau really put it best, though, and I think, to be honest, if there's an award for the best speech of the week, it probably goes to Justin Trudeau, who made an incredibly passionate appeal to do more to promote women in workplaces, to hire more women, to promote more women, and to retain women, both with pay and gender pay parity, but also with, friendly policies that allow people to have, for parents, for example, to keep women in the workforce. So perhaps an issue not central to the agenda here, but certainly one that people were talking about, and one that was very striking and strikingly differently from previous years.
And Stephen, the statements that you hear from Davos, sometimes they move markets. We had earlier in the week the U.S. Finance Secretary Steve Mnuchin saying a weak dollar is a good thing. Is that a 180-degree reversal we've heard from him this Friday?
Well, it's a bit of a hokey-cokey from Steve Mnuchin. So he started out by saying that a weaker dollar is good for trade. I mean, he's not wrong, but the point is that if you're the Treasury Secretary of the United States, you're not supposed to say things like that because the markets react to it. And if the world thinks that you're trying to drive down the dollar to make your goods cheaper, that changes currency markets all across the world. So that was the reaction when Steve Mnuchin made those first comments. Him and Donald Trump as well have sort of rolled back on those comments, saying, look, we're being consistent. We don't talk about the value of the dollar. A strong dollar is good for America as well, but a weaker dollar does help us sell our goods abroad because our goods are cheaper if the dollar is weaker. But they're trying to roll back on the fact that they're not trying to manipulate currency markets, because that's something that really worries other countries, because then you get into a currency war territory when you have countries trying to boost or lower their currencies to make their goods more attractive. So Steve Mnuchin rolling back a little bit on his words earlier in the week, and perhaps hoping that the markets might calm down as well.
Final question for you, Stephen. You really had the sense this year with, on the one hand, Donald Trump, on the other hand, Macron, and as you mentioned, Justin Trudeau, that there really was a debate at Davos this year.
It depends on what you consider a debate. There was a lot of agreement on one side. I suppose Donald Trump probably stands in opposition somewhat to what the rest of the speeches made, but there was a lot of self-promotion going on, as I was saying, from a lot of world leaders. They know that companies have money to invest, and they want to make sure that money comes to them. The tone of this year's Davos meeting is quite different from previous years, and that's partly because the global economy is doing well. They don't have any major pressing issues to worry about, although several people I spoke to said this week they really should worry, because things like, if there's a market correction because we have stock markets at a record high, these are things that we should be worried about. We should be more worried about climate change. We should be more worried about how technology is going to change the world. These issues were all being debated on official programme events here, but it is always the major political speeches that people tend to pay attention to. And it's true that from this year, while we had many passionate speeches on different subjects, perhaps there wasn't as deep a debate about the future of the global economy as there have been in previous years when things haven't been going so well.
Stephen Carroll with the closing word on Davos there. Many thanks for joining us from the World Economic Forum.